The day Carter Whitman called me a man with nothing in front of the entire town, I just stood there in my father's old coat. He said a man who could not afford to replace a cracked window had no right to stop a wealthy investor from buying the Willow Creek train station. People laughed. Vivian Hale did not laugh. She looked toward the old wooden clock hanging on the station wall, where a strip of paint had just peeled away to reveal a narrow gap behind it. No one knew that inside that gap was a secret that would force Carter Whitman to bow his head. The story began on a cold afternoon at the old Willow Creek station. The town council had called a public meeting to vote on selling the station to Carter Whitman. The rows of wooden benches were packed with townspeople. Some of the older ones had known my mother. Some of the shop owners were hoping the new project would bring tourists back. Some people were just there to watch the commotion unfold. I walked in late. My hands were still covered in sawdust because I had just finished repairing the porch awning for Miss Louisa, a widow who lived at the end of Maple Street. I had not had time to change my clothes. My old coat was frayed at the shoulders. My boots were caked with mud. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward me the moment I stepped through the door. Carter Whitman stood at the front of the hall. He wore a dark blue suit, polished leather shoes, and an expensive watch that caught the overhead light. Beside him stood his personal attorney and a large rendering of the resort he planned to build. The contrast between us could not have been more obvious. On one side was a wealthy man who represented money, power, and the promise of progress. On the other side was me, a man the town had already decided was a relic of the past. Carter looked me up and down the way a man inspects something he has already decided is beneath him. His jaw tightened slightly, and a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. It was the kind of contempt that does not bother to disguise itself because it assumes no one present will challenge it. He adjusted the cuff of his shirt, letting his gold cufflink catch the overhead light, and then he said loudly enough for every person in every row to hear, "Elias Turner, well, I am not sure if you came here to bid on this place or to beg for one last free meal before they tear it down." A few people chuckled. Carter saw the reaction and kept going. A man who cannot afford to fix his own windows has no business trying to save an entire train station. This time the laughter was louder. I heard every creak of every chair, every fake cough, every whisper that floated across the room. Some people pitied me. Some avoided my eyes. But others genuinely laughed, and the sound of that laughter settled into my chest like a stone. I did not respond. Not because I was not hurting, but because I had learned a long time ago that silence sometimes lets you hear the true nature of the people around you more clearly than any argument ever could. I looked up at the old wooden clock on the wall. It had stopped running the day my mother died. Strangely, behind the clock, a thin line of paint on the wall had peeled away, as if the building itself was trying to show me something. Vivian Hale, the town's records clerk, noticed it too. Unlike everyone else, she was not laughing. Her gaze shifted from me to the clock and back again, as though she had just realized the station was still holding on to something no one had bothered to look for. Carter's voice echoed in my head as I stood there. "You have nothing, Elias." I looked at the clock and remembered something my mother said before she passed. "When you do not know where to look, look where time has stopped." They all thought I had nothing. They measured me the way the world measures most people, by the condition of my coat, the rust on my truck, the size of my bank account. But the world has a habit of confusing what a man owns with what a man is worth, and those two things are rarely the same. I was born and raised in Willow Creek. My father died when I was young, and my mother raised me alone. She worked as a cook, a cleaner, and a volunteer at the station. I never went to a faraway university, but I learned the craft of woodworking from an old carpenter in town named Earl Givens. My hands learned to measure timber, frame walls, repair staircases, build cabinets, and replace doors. I opened a small woodworking shop called Turner Woodworks. It was never a big operation, but it was enough to let me live with dignity. I used to believe my life would follow a simple, straight line. Work hard, take care of my mother, fix old houses, live quietly. But when my mother got sick, everything changed. Hospital bills, medications, home care, emergency visits in the middle of the night, ambulance rides that cost more than I earned in a month. All of it consumed every dollar I had ever saved. I sold the shop. I sold the small piece of land behind the house. I sold my good truck and the tools I had spent years collecting one by one. I kept only the old wooden house because it was the place my mother wanted to see every morning during her final days. She would sit by the kitchen window and look out at the yard where I used to practice cutting wood as a boy, and even though her body was failing, her eyes still held the same warmth they always had. I did not regret any of it. If I had to do it all over again, I would still choose her. Every single time. But the people in town did not see what I had given up. They only saw what I had lost. They saw a man without a shop, without money, without standing. They called me a failure. Some said I was too soft. Some said a 42-year-old man still living in his dead mother's house had nothing to be proud of. After she passed, I made a living doing small repair jobs. I fixed doors, patched roofs, replaced glass, rebuilt fences. Some people paid me fairly. Some paid me less than what the work was worth. Some had nothing to offer except a bag of vegetables or a loaf of bread. I took it all. Not because I thought of myself as generous, but because I had watched my mother give to others when she herself had very little, and that kind of giving becomes part of your bones after a while. Still, kindness does not make a man rich. I was still poor, still driving the old truck, still wearing the same coat, still being looked at as a man who had slipped off the edge of a respectable life. They saw me lose the shop, I thought to myself many nights. They did not see me hold on to my mother for a few more winters. I did not have many of the things people use to measure success. But I had never lost the one thing my mother taught me. Never take from someone weaker than you just to look stronger in the eyes of someone else. The Willow Creek station was more than a building. It was the last place where I could still hear my mother's voice. When the train still ran, the station was the heart of the town. Soldiers came home through those doors with canvas bags over their shoulders. Families reunited on the platform after months of separation. Children pressed their faces against the windows to watch the engines pull in, and the whole building trembled with the sound of iron and steam. But when the rail line was shut down, the station was abandoned. The glass cracked. The floors gathered dust. The old schedule board faded until the numbers were barely visible. People forgot about it the way they forget about anything that no longer serves an obvious purpose. My mother never forgot. Bonnie Turner looked at the empty waiting room and saw something no one else could see. She asked the town council for permission to use the space as a community kitchen. At first, it was just one pot of soup, a few loaves of bread, a handful of old wooden tables. But then the poor started coming. The elderly who had no one came. The unemployed came. The people who did not want to ask for help but had run out of options came too. My mother never asked anyone why they were poor. She never made them explain their failures or justify their hunger. She only ever asked, "Would you like more soup? Or are you warm enough?" There was a gentleness in the way she moved through that kitchen, as if she understood that the people sitting at those tables needed more than food. They needed to be treated as if they still mattered. I was small, but I helped her set up chairs, wash dishes, chop firewood. I watched strong men cry when she called them by name, men who had not heard their own name spoken with kindness in months. I watched old women hold their bowls of soup like it was the only proof that someone in the world still remembered they existed. I saw a veteran who never spoke sit in the same corner every Tuesday, and my mother would bring him his bowl without a word. Just a hand on his shoulder and a nod, and that was enough. She used to say, "Elias, a town is not measured by who has the tallest house. It is measured by how it treats the weakest person in it." That sentence became the compass I have carried my whole life. Before she died, my mother mentioned the station many times. Once, In the middle of a painful night when her breath came in shallow, difficult waves, she held my hand and whispered, "This station was never meant to belong to greedy hands. When you do not know where to look, look where time has stopped." I thought it was the confused rambling of a dying woman. I did not understand she was talking about the wooden clock in the station that had stopped running. I came back to the present and said to myself, I am not trying to save a building. I'm trying to hold on to the last place where I can still hear my mother's voice. Carter Whitman was not born in Willow Creek. He came from a big city and made his money buying land in small towns, erasing local history, and replacing it with luxury developments for wealthy outsiders. He was good at talking to town councils. He knew exactly what struggling people wanted to hear. Jobs, tax revenue, tourism, growth. During his presentation, Carter projected the design for Whitman Lodge on a screen at the front of the hall. The old station would become a hotel lobby. The waiting room would become a fine dining restaurant. The platform would become a garden venue for weddings and private events. And the community kitchen my mother had built with her own hands would be demolished to make room for a cocktail bar. Many people in town were persuaded. They were tired of being poor. They wanted their shops to have customers again. They wanted their children and grandchildren to have jobs. Carter understood that exhaustion and used it to make them feel like selling the station was the only practical choice left. But Carter's true nature revealed itself when he walked behind the station to inspect the property. I happened to be nearby, fixing a loose board on the back wall, and I heard him say to his assistant, "Clear out that old soup kitchen first. Rich guests do not want to eat dinner next to the memories of poor people." That sentence stopped me where I stood. To me, that kitchen was the place where my mother had saved people from hunger and cold. To him, it was a stain that needed to be wiped away. When I confronted him, Carter did not flinch. He looked at me with the bored patience of a man who had won arguments like this 100 times before. He said, "People like you always confuse memories with ownership. If this place matters so much to you, why did you not buy it yourself?" I had no answer. Because he was right about one thing. I did not have the money. Carter knew it. He did not need to hit me with his fists. He only needed to remind me that in his world, a man without money has no right to hold on to memories. "If your memories are worth something," he said, straightening his tie, "then pay for them." I realized then that if I did not act quickly, my mother's kitchen would be leveled before the town understood what it was about to lose. Vivian Hale was the town's records clerk. She had been assigned to inventory all the documents related to the station before the sale went through. At first, she was just doing her job. She had no reason to trust me, and no reason to oppose Carter. She was thorough, careful, and not the kind of person who was easily swayed by flashy presentations or big promises. One afternoon, she found me repairing the hinge on the kitchen door. The door had sagged so badly that a strong wind could knock it off its frame. I was fixing it even though no one had hired me to do it. Vivian watched me for a moment, then asked, "You know this place is about to be sold. Why are you still fixing things?" I said, "Because if I let it fall apart in front of me, I will feel like I abandoned my mother a second time." That answer silenced her. From that day on, Vivian started paying closer attention. She talked to some of the older residents about Bonnie Turner. She heard stories about how my mother had fed them when they lost their jobs, how she had treated them with dignity when no one else would. Vivian also noticed that Carter was pushing the council to hold the final vote unusually fast. When she checked the land registry, she discovered that the pages related to 1952 were missing. Even more suspicious, in the remaining minutes from that era, she found the signature of a council member with the last name Whitman, Carter's grandfather. That meant Carter's family had been involved in the station's record-keeping decades ago. Vivian did not jump to conclusions. But she told me quietly, "Documents do not just disappear on their own, Elias. They disappear because someone needed them to disappear." She promised to review every file she could find, but she warned me not to tell anyone. If Carter learned she was looking into the records, whatever was left might vanish too. I decided I could not just wait and hope. I had to do my part. I went door to door across Willow Creek collecting signatures to save the station. I carried a handwritten plan with me. The idea was simple: turn the station into a community center. Reopen the kitchen during winter months. Use the old ticket office as a free woodworking class. Convert the waiting room into a small lending library. I knew my plan did not look anything like Carter's glossy rendering. It had no three-dimensional images, no promises of millions of dollars in revenue. But it was real. I could repair the woodwork myself. A few retired electricians could check the wiring. Miss Louisa could help organize the kitchen. Old George could teach basic repair skills. Vivian could manage the library. At first, some people listened. They remembered my mother. They remembered the kitchen. They signed their names. For a few days, I started to feel something I had not felt in a very long time: hope. But Carter struck back fast. He hired a structural engineering firm to evaluate the station, and then publicized a repair estimate so high it terrified the entire town. He also spread the rumor that I was exploiting my dead mother's memory to block a project that would benefit everyone. In a smaller meeting, I presented my community plan. Carter picked it up, glanced at it for a few seconds, then tossed it onto the table like it was a piece of junk mail. He said, "You have no money, no authority, no credentials. All you have is a sad story." The room went silent. The people who had nodded along with me just days ago now stared at the floor. They were not bad people. They were just scared. Scared of staying poor. Scared of the town dying. Scared of turning down what felt like their last chance. I walked out of that meeting feeling crushed. I had tried to do the right thing, and the right thing had been crumpled up and thrown on a table in front of me. Carter's money does not just buy land, I thought as I sat in my truck in the parking lot. It buys the fear of good people. Late that night, my phone rang. It was Vivian. Her voice was low and urgent. She said, "I found a gap in the records, and I think your mother knew exactly where it was hidden." The night before the final vote, I went to the station at Vivian's request. The air was cold, and wind whistled through the cracked window panes. The station was dark and silent, like a memory that had been locked inside itself for too long. Vivian stood in the middle of the waiting room with a notebook in her hand. She told me the missing pages all revolved around 1952, the year the station had been transferred to the town after the rail line changed routes. She had found a reference number for a deed of covenant, but the original document was gone from the archive. What struck her was a line from an old letter my mother had sent to the council years ago. In it, my mother had written, "Remember the Turner condition." Vivian asked me if I knew what the Turner condition was. I shook my head. Then I remembered my mother's words from her deathbed. "When you do not know where to look, look where time has stopped." I had turned and stared at the wooden clock on the wall. It had stopped at 6:17, the exact time my mother had passed away. For years, I thought I had never repaired it because the pain was too fresh. But now, standing in that cold room with Vivian beside me, the clock looked less like a broken timepiece and more like a marker someone had left behind on purpose. Vivian helped me lift the clock off the wall. It was heavier than I expected, and as we set it gently on the floor, a fine cloud of dust rose into the air. Behind it, the plaster was cracked in a pattern that did not look accidental, and a section of paint had peeled away to reveal the grain of old wood underneath. I used a small knife to pry at the edge. My fingers were shaking. Vivian held a flashlight steady. A thin wooden panel came loose with a soft creak, revealing a narrow cavity built into the wall itself, a space someone had deliberately constructed and then hidden behind the clock decades ago. Inside was a metal tube wrapped in oilcloth, covered in dust but perfectly intact, as if it had been waiting patiently for the right person to come looking. My hands were trembling when I opened it. Inside was an old deed of covenant, a land survey map, several handwritten letters, and a black and white photograph. In the photograph, my grandfather Silas Turner stood in front of the station alongside the former mayor of Willow Creek. Vivian read the covenant slowly. Her face changed as she reached the final clause. It stated clearly that if the Willow Creek station was ever sold, transferred, or converted to private commercial use, full ownership would automatically revert to the legal descendants of the Turner family. I could not speak. I had come here to save my mother's memory. I did not know that her memory was also protecting my family's legal right. Vivian looked at me, her brown hair falling softly across her shoulders, her eyes wide with something between disbelief and fierce determination. She said, "Elias, if this document holds up, Carter cannot buy this station. The only person who has the right to decide its future is you." I looked at the covenant in my hands and understood that tomorrow, the entire town would have to hear a truth that someone had buried for more than 70 years. The next morning, the station was more packed than I had ever seen it. Everyone knew this was the day of the final vote. Carter had his contract ready. The Whitman Lodge rendering sat on a display easel. His attorney stood beside him with a pen already in hand. The council members sat at the front table. The townspeople murmured behind them. I walked in with Vivian. She carried the covenant carefully inside a document folder. I was still wearing my old coat, still wearing my old boots. Nothing about my appearance had changed. So Carter still believed I had come to lose. He looked at me and laughed. "Elias, did you come to take one last look at the place you never owned?" A few people laughed again. Fewer this time, but the sound still cut. I looked around the room. I saw people who had eaten my mother's soup. I saw people whose doors I had repaired. I saw people who had promised to sign my petition but now could not meet my eyes. Carter stepped closer. He spoke loud enough for the entire hall to hear. "You have nothing. No money, no power, no future. You are just standing in the way of people who can actually do something great for this town." I was silent for a few seconds. Then I said, "You are right. I do not have the thing you worship, but I have the thing you tried to bury." The room went completely still. Carter frowned. Vivian stepped forward. She asked the town attorney to read the covenant aloud. Carter smirked at first. He said old papers could not stop a modern deal. But as the attorney began reading, the atmosphere in the room shifted like the air before a storm. The covenant stated that my grandfather Silas Turner had transferred the right to use the station to the town of Willow Creek on the condition that it serve the public good. The final clause was unambiguous. If the station was sold, transferred, or repurposed for private commercial gain, ownership would revert to the lawful descendants of the Turner family. I was the only living descendant. The hall fell completely silent. The people who had been laughing at me minutes earlier dropped their eyes. Several of the older residents began to cry, remembering my mother, remembering the kitchen, remembering Silas Turner. Carter stood frozen, but he was not the kind of man who surrendered easily. He slammed his hand on the table. This document could be forged. A man as desperate as Elias has every reason to fabricate something like this. And Vivian could easily have been manipulated. The accusation sent a ripple of doubt through the room. A few people looked at me with suspicion again. This was the moment that mattered most. The truth was out, but a poor man is always doubted first. I wanted to speak, but Vivian had already prepared for this. She produced the original land survey map with a matching reference number, the notary seal, a letter from the former mayor, the black and white photograph of Silas Turner at the station, and the remaining entries from the council minutes. She pointed out that the missing section in the land registry corresponded exactly to the reversion clause. She also demonstrated that the person responsible for the archives during that period was a member of the Whitman family. Carter's face drained of color. His lips pressed together until they were white. His hands, which had been resting confidently on the table, curled into fists, and I could see the tendons in his neck tighten as the truth closed in around him. He began to lose control. He argued that it was ancient history, that the town needed to move forward. That sentiment could not feed families or repair roads. But the town attorney, after carefully examining the notary seal and cross-referencing the registry numbers, declared the document valid. The attorney spoke in a measured, careful voice. Under the terms of this covenant, the council does not have the authority to sell this station for private commercial purposes. If the sale proceeds, ownership reverts to Mr. Elias Turner. Every person in the room turned to look at me. The man they thought had nothing had just become the only person with the power to stop Carter Whitman. Carter looked at me, and for the first time there was no contempt in his eyes. Only fear. After the meeting broke up, Carter pulled me into the hallway near the old kitchen. He was no longer smiling, no longer performing for the crowd. His voice was low, fast, and cold. He told me I had had my moment, but moments do not pay bills. He reminded me about the leaking roof, the rusted truck, the shop I had lost. He said if I signed over the rights, he would pay me more money than I had earned in my entire life. The number he offered made me go quiet. I could not pretend I was not tempted. I'd lived with scarcity for so long that the weight of it had become part of my posture, part of the way I walked into rooms, part of the way I expected the world to treat me. I knew what it felt like to count every dollar before paying the electric bill. I knew what it felt like to hear the roof groan in a storm and pray it would hold one more season. I knew what it felt like to be looked at as a man who could no longer stand up straight in life. Carter saw the hesitation in my eyes. He leaned in and said, "Just sign. You will have everything you have ever lacked." For one long, terrible moment, I could almost see a different life. The house repaired, the porch no longer sagging, the windows sealed against the winter cold. The shop reopened, the smell of fresh-cut pine filling the air again. A new truck parked in the driveway. No more laughter behind my back. No more pitying glances. No more being the man people crossed the street to avoid because poverty made them uncomfortable. I could take Carter's money and tell myself I deserved it. I could walk away from Willow Creek and start over somewhere nobody knew my name or my story. But then I looked into the old kitchen. On the shelf, my mother's large soup pot was still there, covered in dust but never thrown away. I remembered her standing in this room, stirring broth for people who had nowhere else to go. I remembered her voice. Never sell the place where other people survived. I understood then that if I sold, Carter would win in the deepest way possible. Not because he would own the land, but because he would have proven that every promise has a price. I turned back to him. His expensive suit, his polished shoes, his watch that cost more than my truck. I looked him in the eyes and said, "You can buy land anywhere in this country. But you cannot buy my promise to my mother." Carter stared at me the way a man stares at something he genuinely cannot comprehend. A poor man turning down the kind of money that could erase every hardship, every humiliation, every cold night spent listening to the wind howl through a broken window. His mouth opened, then closed. His jaw worked silently, as if he were searching for words that could still bend the situation back under his control. But there were none. He turned and walked away without another word, his polished shoes clicking against the old wooden floor, each step a little faster than the last, as if the station itself was pushing him out. I went back into the hall and told the council the station would not be sold. I did not keep the station for myself. I did not use my legal right to make money. I stood before the council and announced that the Turner family would exercise its reversion rights to block any commercial sale, and the station would be converted into the Turner Community House. The council was forced to halt the entire sale process. An investigation was opened into the missing archive pages. Carter Whitman's reputation collapsed. The people who had supported him began to realize they had been led by fear and the seduction of easy money. Carter left Willow Creek without a single round of applause following him out. But I did not focus on his defeat. I focused on bringing the station back to life. Vivian took over the old waiting room and turned it into a lending library. The first shelves were filled with donated books from townspeople. Old George helped repair the tables and chairs. Miss Louisa brought curtains she had sewn herself. A group of retired tradesmen helped me inspect the roof and the floors. I used the old ticket office to teach free woodworking classes for anyone who was out of work and needed a skill. My mother's kitchen was cleaned from floor to ceiling. Every surface was scrubbed, every shelf wiped down, every corner swept. The big soup pot was washed until it gleamed and placed back on the stove, where it had always belonged. That first winter, the kitchen came alive again. The stove burned hot, and the warmth spread through the old walls like a heartbeat returning to a body that had been still for too long. The windows fogged with steam. Old folks sat by the window watching the snow fall outside, their hands wrapped around warm mugs. People who had once been ashamed of needing help were welcomed in like honored guests. No one asked them if they had money. No one asked them to explain why they were there. They were simply fed, and in being fed, they were told without words that they still had a place in this world. One afternoon, Miss Louisa took my hand and held it tight. She looked at me with tears running down her face and said, "Your mother would be so proud of you." I could not answer. I just looked at the wooden clock on the wall. I had finally repaired it. The hands moved again, ticking softly through the quiet room. But I left a small scratch on the back of the frame, a reminder that some truths only reveal themselves to the person patient enough to look for them. Vivian walked over and stood beside me. Her brown hair fell gently over her shoulders, and her eyes were soft but bright, with something I had not seen directed at me in a very long time. She held out a new key to the Turner Community House. She said quietly, "They thought you had nothing." I looked through the old wooden doorway at the people inside. I heard laughter. I heard the clinking of bowls and spoons. I smelled soup warming on the stove. I thought about my mother, about the nights she stood in this kitchen giving everything she had to people who had nothing. I thought about my grandfather, who had written a single clause into a covenant to make sure this place would always belong to the ones who needed it most. I thought about every person who had ever looked at me and seen only a man in an old coat. I turned to Vivian and said, "No." They just did not know what I was holding on to. Because the truth is, some people carry their wealth in bank accounts, and some people carry it in the promises they refuse to break. Some people build empires out of concrete and steel, and some people build them out of a single pot of soup in a kitchen that never turns anyone away. The world will always measure you by what it can see. But the things that matter most are almost always hidden, tucked behind a stopped clock, written into a covenant no one bothered to read, kept alive in the memory of a mother who believed that kindness was the only currency that never loses its value. They thought I had nothing, but the truth is, I was holding my mother's memory, my family's promise, and a truth that money could never bury.